CEO panics at global meeting. Then the black janitor stands up and speaks fluent Korean. It was supposed to be a flawless day. The top floor of Monarch Tech's glass skyscraper was buzzing. The lights in the boardroom had been adjusted. The catering team had finished setting up high-end hors d'oeuvres, and the city skyline sparkled through the panoramic windows. Everything was ready for the most important meeting of the year, a multi-million-dollar deal with a South Korean electronics giant, K-Mirei Corporation. But then, disaster struck. "What do you mean he cancelled?" shouted Jason Monroe, the CEO of Monarch Tech, into his phone. His voice echoed sharply down the polished hallway, sending nervous glances among the assistants and interns bustling nearby. "Yes, I understand it's a family emergency, but the meeting is in less than 20 minutes, Jason barked, running a hand through his perfectly styled silver hair. Their only official Korean English interpreter had just cancelled. Without him, there was no way to bridge the cultural gap with the Korean delegation that had flown in from Seoul the night before. Monarch Tech had been chasing this $300 million joint venture for almost a year. And now it could all fall apart over one missing translator. Jason's assistant, Emily, looked like she might cry. "I've called every agency in the city. No one, and I mean no one, is available right now. At least no one credible enough to handle a negotiation of this size." Jason cursed under his breath. "I'm going to have to reschedule." "They're already downstairs," Emily whispered. Elevator just pinged. Jason turned pale. While the chaos unfolded, someone else had been quietly listening, someone nobody even noticed. Daniel Brooks, the building's janitor, stood at the far end of the hallway, mop in hand, quietly emptying a trash bin into his cleaning cart. At 35, Daniel was a quiet man, kind eyes, dark brown skin, always wearing his green maintenance uniform. He was polite, always on time, always invisible. But now he cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me, sir," he said, stepping closer. Jason turned, slightly annoyed. "What is it?" Daniel paused, then said, "I can interpret for the meeting." Jason blinked. "You what?" "I speak Korean," Daniel said, standing straighter. "Fluently." Emily looked like someone had just suggested using Google Translate for a nuclear treaty. "This isn't a game," Jason said, his voice tight. "Do you even understand what's on the line here?" "I do," Daniel replied. "And I wouldn't offer if I wasn't confident. I studied Korean literature and business communications at UCLA, spent a year teaching English in Busan after graduation." Jason stared at him, struggling to process the janitor's words. "But why are you mopping our floors?" Daniel looked him in the eye. "My wife was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 2 years ago. I took this job for the health insurance." Silence. For a moment, the only sound in the hallway was the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. Emily looked at Jason, then back at Daniel. "Sir, they're walking in now." Jason hesitated, then made a decision. "You. With me. You screw this up, I swear." "I won't," Daniel said calmly. The boardroom fell silent as 5 Korean executives entered, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. Jason stood at the head of the table. "Welcome, gentlemen. We're honored to have you here." Daniel stepped forward and translated, flawlessly, politely, with every cultural nuance perfectly intact. Not just the words, but the tone, the respect, the rhythm of Korean business etiquette. The delegation leader, Mr. Park, raised his eyebrows. "Your interpreter has excellent diction," he said in Korean. "Where did he study?" "UCLA," Daniel replied in fluent Korean. "But I learned more by living in your country than I ever did in class." Mr. Park smiled faintly, nodding in approval. The next hour went by like a well-rehearsed symphony. Daniel translated every sentence, every proposal, every joke, and every concern with absolute precision. The Korean delegation, originally stiff and guarded, visibly relaxed. Jason couldn't believe it. He sat at the head of the table, watching his janitor-turned-savior work a kind of quiet magic. But not everyone in the room was pleased. Jessica Lang, VP of Operations, leaned toward Jason during a break. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "We're letting a janitor run our international meeting?" Jason didn't respond. "This is reckless," Jessica hissed. "What if they find out? What does it say about our professionalism?" But Jason didn't hear her. He was watching Mr. Park, the way he smiled more warmly now, how the Korean executives leaned in, finally talking openly about the deal points. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Park looked at Daniel and asked, "Tell me, Mr. Brooks, do you believe Monarch is ready to enter the Korean market?" Daniel paused, glancing briefly at Jason. Then he answered, "Not as a janitor, but as a strategist. I think your company wants a partner, not just a client," he said in Korean. "And if Monarch Tech continues to view this as a transactional deal instead of a cultural exchange, it will fail. But if they listen more and speak less, it might just work." The room went quiet. Then Mr. Park nodded. "Well said." The delegation left with smiles and handshakes. A preliminary agreement had been reached. The deal wasn't just saved, it had been made stronger. Back in the hallway, Jason turned to Daniel. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. Daniel shrugged. "I just paid attention." Jason stared at him for a long moment, then said, "Come to my office. We need to talk." But not everyone was ready for that. Later that evening, as Daniel was finishing up his shift, Jessica approached him in the hallway. "You embarrassed this company," she said sharply. "People are talking. We looked unprofessional." Daniel looked up at her calmly. "And yet, the deal went through." "You don't belong in that room," she snapped. Daniel didn't flinch. "Maybe, but I belonged in that language." Jessica turned and walked away. The next morning, Daniel received an official summons to the executive floor, a place he usually cleaned after hours. He was escorted into the CEO's office. Jason sat behind his mahogany desk, flanked by Emily and two board members. "Mr. Brooks," Jason began, "we owe you a great deal." Daniel nodded, saying nothing. "We did some digging," Jason continued. "We saw your old resume, your GPA, your thesis on intercultural negotiation. You could have been anywhere." "I was," Daniel replied quietly. "At my wife's side." Jason leaned forward. "What if I told you we wanted to offer you a new position? Full-time cultural liaison and global market advisor?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that a fancy way of saying translator?" Jason smiled faintly. "Number. It's a fancy way of saying you belong in the room now." Weeks passed. Daniel traded in his uniform for a tailored navy suit. His days were no longer spent mopping floors, but advising the CEO, negotiating with international clients, and reshaping the company's global strategy. He still took the elevator alone every morning, still got coffee from the same cafe downstairs, still lived in the same modest apartment in Queens, but something had changed. At a company-wide quarterly meeting, Jason stood before 300 employees and shared the story of how their company nearly lost a deal and how a janitor had saved it. Then he stepped aside and invited Daniel to the stage. Daniel looked out over the audience, pausing for a moment. "When people look at you and see only your job title," he said, "don't let them define your value. I used to think I didn't belong. But the truth is, I just hadn't been seen yet." Applause thundered through the auditorium. 6 months later, Monarch Tech had opened 2 satellite offices in Seoul and Busan. Daniel was flying back and forth monthly. His salary had tripled. His wife now had full-time care at home, and her condition had stabilized. He didn't seek fame. He still moved quietly through hallways, still listened more than he spoke. But within the company, his story had become legend. New hires whispered about the janitor who became VP. Interns looked up to him. Executives deferred to him in meetings. And Jessica? She had quietly resigned 2 months earlier after her own email chain, mocking Daniel's background, was leaked by an anonymous source. No one really asked who exposed it. Daniel never said a word. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's standing exactly where they said you didn't belong and thriving anyway. Daniel Brooks was more than a janitor. He was proof that dignity, intelligence, and talent can live in the quietest corners of any building. He listened. He learned. He waited. And when his moment came, he spoke, and the whole room listened. If this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful real-life stories of courage, dignity, and the quiet power of those we too often ignore.